$15 billion. That's the number echoing through Ouagadougou's corridors of power, a sum so vast, so heavy, it could build cities, heal hospitals, or light the villages still cloaked in darkness. Yet today, that number carries a haunting question. Where did the money go? When Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his people and ordered a full audit of the IMF loans, it was more than a bureaucratic gesture. It was a thunderclap in a silent storm, a call for truth in a world used to shadows. They said the loans were for progress, for hope, for the nation's rebirth. But as the years passed, the people saw little change. Roads unfinished, schools half-built, projects that existed only on paper. So tonight we ask, who held the pen that signed away billions? Who guarded the vault? And who walked away richer? This is not just politics. It's a story of justice, of betrayal, and of a nation asking its leaders, where is our future? Stay with me. And if you believe truth still matters, subscribe, because this story is only beginning. There's a rhythm to history, a rhythm that repeats itself again and again whenever the powerful promise salvation with a price tag attached. And in Burkina Faso, that rhythm began the day the International Monetary Fund walked through the door, carrying $15 billion worth of hope and control. They said it was help. They said it was partnership. They said it was the key to the nation's future. But when you've lived long enough, you learn, not every gift is a blessing, and not every handshake is sincere. The year was turbulent, inflation rising. The people tired of speeches that led nowhere. The old regime had fallen, and a new leader had taken the stage. Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier with fire in his eyes and the weight of a wounded country on his back. Burkina Faso was standing on the edge. The nation's debt was climbing, infrastructure crumbling, and its young people leaving in search of a life beyond the desert winds. The IMF arrived like a doctor with a shining syringe. They spoke the language of rescue. Economic stability, fiscal reform, structural adjustment. They painted pictures of modern highways, new schools, digital banking, clean energy grids. They said, "This loan will change your future." And who could resist $15 billion? Contracts were signed in air-conditioned rooms, beneath flags and cameras, while journalists scribbled headlines about a new dawn for Burkina Faso. The ministers smiled. The ambassadors shook hands, and somewhere in that moment, a nation's faith was sold on credit. The first transfers came quietly. Billions wired in phases, managed by layers of ministries, development agencies, and trusted partners. Documents were drafted with words so dense, so technical, that even the accountants struggled to decipher them. At first, everything seemed on track. Bulldozers rolled out. Surveyors marked the land for new schools and bridges. But within months, progress slowed. The machines stopped, the workers went home, and the promises began to evaporate like morning mist. By the end of the first year, questions started to rise from the villages. Where's the road they said would reach us? Where's the hospital for our children? Where did the money go? The government answered with reports, thick, official, and silent. Now understand this, Burkina Faso isn't a land without heart. The people are patient, proud, and enduring. They've known struggle. They've known sacrifice, but even the strongest faith begins to shake when you see billions borrowed in your name, and not one brick laid in your town. Inside the ministries, a quiet unease grew. Those who asked too many questions were transferred. Others were told, it's complicated. International accounting you wouldn't understand. And yet the numbers didn't add up. 100 million here for capacity building, 200 million there for technical support. Another 500 million marked confidential disbursement, paper trails that led nowhere. Then came the reports, the ones not meant for the public. They spoke of unexplained variances, irregular transactions, deviations in fund allocation. In plain words, money was missing. Whispers filled the corridors. This minister bought properties in Europe. That official's cousin owns a new consultancy firm. Another one, he opened an offshore account, and all of it somehow was within the guidelines. The IMF kept sending updates, glowing with bureaucratic optimism. Progress on track. Structural goals achieved. But on the ground, the people saw none of it. The schools remained closed, the clinics still empty, the roads still dust. Then, one morning, as the sun rose over Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his cabinet and spoke a sentence that sliced through the silence like a blade. If we took $15 billion in loans, the people deserve to know where every franc went. The room froze. Some lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably. Because that question, simple as it was, could tear apart the illusion that had kept the machine running. He wasn't just talking about numbers. He was talking about truth. And truth, my friend, is a dangerous thing in a world built on comfort and compromise. In the following days, Traoré quietly requested financial reports. Not the summaries sent to the IMF, but the real ones, the internal ledgers. What he found there was chaos. Incomplete data, mismatched figures, missing authorizations, money allocated to ministries that no longer existed, expenses claimed twice, projects listed as completed that hadn't even begun, and yet the repayments had already started, with interest. That's when it hit him. The loan that was meant to lift the country was instead choking it. Every dollar borrowed in hope was being paid back in pain. The irony was cruel. The IMF called it support, but the people called it a burden. For the foreign consultants, the $15 billion was an opportunity for contracts, commissions, studies, and advisory missions. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was a promise that never arrived. But Traoré, the soldier who once marched through sandstorms, was not the kind to bow his head. He had seen what silence costs, and he had seen how truth, though painful, is the only thing that heals. He made a decision, not of politics, but of conscience. He would open the books. He would trace every franc, every signature, every shadow. Because when a leader borrows money in the name of his people, those people have a right, a sacred right, to know where it went. So he called his advisors. He summoned the finance ministry. And with the authority of a man unafraid to lose everything but his honor, he said, "We will audit every cent of that IMF loan." And with that decree, silence fell over the capital. The comfortable grew restless, the guilty grew afraid, and the people, for the first time in years, began to hope again. Because somewhere deep inside, they knew, when one man dares to speak truth to power, the rhythm of history can change. But as we'll soon discover, when you follow the money, you don't just find figures, you find ghosts. And some of those ghosts still walk the halls of power. It started with silence. Not with a thunderous announcement, not with a camera flashing or a press conference lined with flags. No. It started with a man alone in his office, pen in hand, resolve carved into the set of his jaw. Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré did not need to shout. He simply signed. And with that signature, the ground beneath the capital shifted. The order, though brief, struck with the weight of history, a full audit, total, uncompromising, of all transactions, all transfers, all whispers tied to the $15 billion IMF loan. From the day the first dollar landed in Burkina Faso's account to the final franc disbursed, the president wanted everything uncovered. And not just the money. He wanted the truth. The decree moved fast. Within hours, it reached the ministries. Within minutes, it sparked panic. The quiet hum of routine was shattered. Civil servants closed their office doors, speaking in hushed tones. Files disappeared. Hard drives were quietly removed, replaced, wiped. Those who had once spoken boldly of development and partnership were now scrambling, searching, erasing. In the corridors of finance, the air grew heavy with fear. Not because of a coup, not because of war, but because of an audit. An audit that could peel back the layers of comfort and expose the fragile truths buried beneath. And, while panic settled in the capital, news of the order spread like wildfire. Out in the villages, where development had been promised but never delivered, people gathered under trees. In marketplaces, at radio shops to hear the announcement for themselves. There were no facts yet, only a feeling. Something different was happening. A leader, at last, was looking back, not forward, to see what had been done in the people's name, and more dangerously, what had been stolen. But not everyone welcomed the light. Within the presidential cabinet, concern cloaked itself in the robes of reason. Advisors cautioned the president to tread lightly. "This will frighten investors," they said. "It will sour our relationship with the IMF. You must not make enemies of the West." And perhaps they were right, because within days, the murmurs started. First came the carefully worded emails from foreign embassies. Then the soft statements from Western press, praising transparency. Yes, but reminding the world of the risks of political instability. The IMF, caught in a public relations storm it did not expect, responded with vague support for partnership and accountability. Yet behind the pleasantries, a message was being crafted. Don't dig too deep. You see, this audit, though national in scale, was global in implication. It threatened to reveal not just local corruption, but international complicity. For when billions vanish, they do not disappear into thin air. They pass through banks, through firms, through hands in Brussels, Geneva, Dubai. And in asking where the money went, Traoré wasn't just asking about Burkina Faso. He was asking about everyone who profited from its pain. But still, he did not back down. In one late-night address, no teleprompter, no applause, he looked into the camera and spoke not to the world, but to his people. His voice was steady, unshaken. If seeking the truth offends, then perhaps what we've built cannot stand truth. But I was not called to protect comfort. I was called to protect the people. It was not a speech. It was a sermon. The next morning, the audit officially began. Teams were assembled, old files reopened, bank records requested. Every project tied to IMF funds, from roads that were never paved to clinics that had no staff, now stood under the microscope. And as the auditors entered buildings long sealed, eyes followed them, not in curiosity but in fear. Because truth, once invited, is hard to control. It brings with it the ghosts. Across the nation, the atmosphere thickened. Supporters cheered. Civil society praised the president's courage. Opposition figures, however, smelled blood. Some called it a distraction. Others began preparing their own narratives. Traoré is destabilizing the economy, they said. He's isolating us from our partners. But deep inside, they all knew what was coming. And so did he. Because this audit was not about paperwork. It was about power. And power, when threatened, does not go quietly. And so as the dust settled over the capital, one truth remained. A storm had begun. Not of bullets or protests, but of paper, of signatures, of accountability. And the man who signed that audit order, He stood alone, not because no one supported him, but because no one else was willing to stand where lightning strikes. And just beyond the doors of the palace, the old order, bruised, embarrassed, cornered, was beginning to stir. Because when a man dares to shine a light into the dark, he must be ready for what the dark sends back. Once the order was signed and the silence broken, the hunt began. It wasn't the kind of hunt you see in movies. No chase through the streets, no fugitives leaping over fences. No. This was quieter, slower, deadlier. A hunt through paperwork, through forgotten files, crumbling ledgers, and digital trail buried under layers of authorized procedures. But make no mistake, it was a hunt, and the prey was truth. The audit teams moved room to room like surgeons in a decaying body. They opened drawers that hadn't been touched in years. They examined project plans that existed only on paper. They requested explanations for invoices that defied logic, $500,000 for meeting refreshments, $3 million for capacity building, $10 million marked technical support, confidential. What did it all mean? Who approved it? Where did the money go? Answers did not come easily. Many who had once spoken loudly of progress now suffered sudden lapses of memory. I don't recall. That was handled by a previous administration. It's all in the files. But the files were missing, or worse, altered. And still, the auditors pushed forward. Every receipt became a relic, every spreadsheet a battlefield, because each figure, each dollar, had to tell a story. And when it couldn't, someone had to. They began to see a pattern, a rhythm. Money came in, then moved quickly, often within hours. From the central account to various ministries, from ministries to third-party contractors, from contractors to somewhere else. They traced one project, a rural electrification initiative meant to bring solar panels to isolated villages. On paper, the funds had been released, accounted for, and signed off. But when investigators visited the site, there was nothing. No panels, no wiring, just a rusted sign, empowering the future. They followed another, a women's empowerment program, $6 million allocated, 3 consultancy firms involved, dozens of workshops promised. But not one woman in the listed communities had heard of it. Not one had attended a session. Not one cent had reached them. And then came the names. Offshore companies registered in places the average Burkinabe had never heard of, the British Virgin Islands, Seychelles, Malta, some linked to government officials, others tied to development advisors flown in from Europe. One firm, with no physical office and only 2 employees, had received contracts worth over $50 million for logistical coordination. But what was being coordinated? The auditors requested bank statements. Some banks complied, others stalled. And then, the leaks began. A junior accountant, anonymous and afraid, slipped a USB drive into a sealed envelope. Inside, transfers to private accounts in Dubai, linked to shell companies created just months before the contracts were signed. Another insider revealed memos, internal warnings from years ago that had been ignored, buried, dismissed. Red flags, one document said, suggest irregularities in disbursement practices. But no one had stopped it. No one had spoken. Because the system wasn't broken, it was built to function this way. Contracts were awarded without tender. Oversight committees were made up of the very people being audited. Evaluation reports were copied and pasted across years, with only the dates changed. One official, when questioned about a recurring technical mission to Europe, simply shrugged and said, "That's how it's always been done." The deeper they dug, the darker it got. And yet, even as the truth emerged in fragments, it wasn't the scale of theft that shocked the people most. It was the ease of it, the casual nature, the confidence with which public money was treated like private inheritance. Not stolen in the dead of night, but in broad daylight, with contracts and signatures and stamps of approval. At every turn, one phrase echoed through the halls of investigation. It came from above. But above who? The question dangled in the air like smoke, because the higher they climbed in the hierarchy, the more resistance they met. Doors closed, phones went unanswered, files suddenly classified. Even allies of the president began to grow nervous. This audit, they whispered, was going too far. It was pulling down not just one curtain, but the whole stage. Still, Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré pressed on. He read the reports in silence. He marked names in red. He sent quiet instructions. Follow this transfer. Double-check that contractor. Push further. Because he knew, if he stopped now, the whole thing would be buried again, and the people, his people, would be left with nothing but ashes and explanations. In the capital, fear returned, but this time, it wasn't the fear of instability. It was the fear of exposure, that names would be published, that arrests might follow, that the world would see what was done with the money meant for the poor. Traoré had torn open a wound that had been festering for years, and now all that pus was pouring out. But, as every healer knows, when you open a wound, you must be ready to cleanse it completely, or risk letting the infection spread deeper. And Traoré, he was not done digging. Truth is a powerful thing, but power is something else entirely. The deeper the audit went, the more the silence began to crack, and from those cracks came the growl of the old guard, soft at first, measured, dressed in the language of diplomacy, but anyone who's lived long enough knows. When power feels cornered, it doesn't beg. It bites. At first, the response came in whispers. Press statements laced with concern. International observers urging restraint. Editorials in Western papers questioning the timing of the audit. Too aggressive, they said. Too political. Risky for the region. But beneath the polite phrasing, the message was clear. Traoré, stop digging. Inside Burkina Faso, the backlash took shape like smoke. Invisible, creeping, suffocating. In Parliament, murmurs grew louder. Lawmakers who had once applauded his boldness now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Opposition figures, long irrelevant, suddenly found their voices again. This audit is a distraction, they claimed. A political stunt, others said. He's dividing the country, they warned. But it wasn't just politicians. It was the quiet army of power, the ones in tailored suits and discreet villas. The ones who never raised their voices because they never needed to. They pulled strings from behind curtains. Contracts were suddenly suspended. Investments delayed. Foreign donors began reassessing commitments. Embassies became colder. Then came the subtle threats. A Western ambassador allegedly told a minister off the record, "Transparency is good until it destabilizes the market." The IMF, once a smiling partner in development, now spoke in cooler tones. Their representatives asked for constructive dialogue, hinted at shared responsibility, and cautioned against unintended consequences. Behind their words, discomfort. Because Traoré was not just exposing corrupt officials. He was pulling back the curtain on the entire ecosystem, one that included foreign consultants, offshore banks, and multilateral blind spots. And power does not like to be unmasked. Meanwhile, inside his own cabinet, fractures appeared. Advisors warned him to slow down. Some said they feared for his safety. Others quietly resigned. But Traoré did not waver. He walked the halls of the palace with the calm of a man who had already counted the cost. And when asked if he would stop the audit to preserve political harmony, he looked straight into the camera and said, You don't clean a wound by covering it. You clean it by exposing it, no matter how deep the rot. Still, he was not naive. He knew what came next. In Africa, and in much of the world, when a leader dares to challenge the unseen hands behind the throne, the consequences are never light. Sometimes it's scandal. Sometimes exile. Sometimes worse. And yet he pressed on. Because somewhere out there, a mother was still walking 5 miles to a clinic that never got built. A teacher was still waiting for her salary, while the ministry reported fully funded reforms. A village was still dark at night, while someone in Europe cashed dividends from a solar project. So yes, the wolves were circling, but Traoré, he was no sheep. Still, even the strongest lions can be outnumbered, and the question that now loomed like a storm over Ouagadougou was this: would truth survive if power decided it shouldn't? Now the dust hangs in the air. The audit is not over, but it has already changed everything. In ministries once untouched, silence has taken root. Men who once held power now walk lighter, their smiles thinner, their calendars suddenly full of urgent overseas travel. Some files remain missing. Some answers will never come. But the curtain has been pulled back, and the people at last have seen the stage. Across Burkina Faso, something unfamiliar is stirring. Not celebration, not yet, but awakening. The questions have grown louder, the anger more focused. In villages, old men who once sat quietly in the shade now ask, "Where's the report?" In schools, teachers print articles from WhatsApp and explain them to students. In markets, women talk about funding gaps with the clarity of economists. Because when a people see truth, even for a moment, they cannot unsee it. Yet Traoré stands alone more than ever. The world, once curious, has grown cold. Western media have turned the page. Donors have shifted focus. The IMF says it is monitoring the situation. But the pressure is still there, only quieter now, more surgical. Like a hand around the throat, never squeezing, just reminding you it's there. Within his own party, unity is a performance. Some believe in him, others endure him, and a few, the ones with everything to lose, are just waiting for a slip, a scandal, an excuse. But so far, it hasn't come. Because Traoré knows what's at stake. He knows the audit isn't just about $15 billion. It's about trust. It's about whether a government can be honest enough to say, "We failed you." It's about whether justice is possible in a system designed to protect everything but justice. So what happens next? Perhaps the audit will finish. Perhaps names will be published, trials held, money recovered. Or perhaps it will all be buried, quietly, bureaucratically, politely. Another file marked classified, another promise marked pending. And that's the danger. Not just that corruption exists, but that we get used to it. But Traoré has chosen a different road, and whether he finishes the journey or not, he has left footprints in the dust for others to follow. Because the fight for truth does not end with exposure. It ends with accountability. And that fight, the one between justice and forgetting, is only just beginning. So here we are. $15 billion borrowed, schools promised, clinics imagined, bridges drawn on blueprints that never touched the earth. What remains? A nation still waiting, a people still watching, but this time, watching with eyes wide open. Because Burkina Faso President Ibrahim Traoré did what few dared to do. He lifted the veil, he followed the trail, and he asked the question that shook the very foundations of comfort. Where did the money go? It is a question not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation that has sat across the table from the IMF. Every leader who has signed a loan for the people. Every official who approved a deal they never intended to fulfill. And for every citizen, too. For you and me, who wondered why the water still doesn't run, why the roads still flood, why the power still cuts off, even after billions have been borrowed in our name. Maybe we'll never recover all the money. Maybe the names at the top will never see the inside of a courtroom. Maybe justice, real justice, will remain a dream deferred, but something has already changed. The lie no longer goes unchallenged. The silence is no longer unbroken, and the people are no longer asleep. So, what now? Will other leaders follow Traoré's path? Will citizens in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya say, audit ours too? Will the IMF face its own reflection? That, my friend, is where you come in. If this story stirred something in you, and if it made you angry, curious, hopeful, don't let it stop here. Comment below. Do you believe the full truth will come out? Should Traoré publish the audit results for the world to see? What would you ask your own government about their IMF loans? Let's talk. Let's remember. Let's refuse to forget. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories that ask the hard questions, that fight for clarity in a world addicted to confusion, subscribe. Stay with us. The next chapter is coming, and you won't want to miss it. Ibrahim Traoré news is no longer a footnote. He is a headline, and Burkina Faso president is no longer just a title. It is a test of truth. Because in this battle between memory and forgetting, silence and speaking up, you are not just a viewer. You are a witness.